Hello, greetings, and welcome. In this series, I'm going to attempt to answer the question of why when we look at the stars using microwaves, radio waves, visible light, UV, infrared, etc., for all intents and purposes, it looks like there's no intelligent life out there. Given that there's a mind-boggling number of stars in the universe, that's something that's very puzzling to a lot of people, including a lot of very intelligent scientists. While I haven't planned this series down to the episode, I'm going to try to link my episodes here. Episode 1 is obviously the introduction, the one you're watching. In later episodes, we'll talk about star size and metallicity. After that, we'll talk about supernova. We'll talk about any other factors related to galactic position. At that point, it will be a good point to zoom in on Earth and discuss abiogenesis, or the spontaneous formation of the first life form. We'll talk about the existence of carbon molecules for life to use. Then we'll talk about the thermodynamics of a closed system planet, photosynthesis, and oxygen as an oxidizer. We'll discuss eukaryotes, what makes them special or critical to complex life. We'll talk about animals and the Cambrian explosion. Finally, we'll talk about the brain and the long, brainy road from worm to human. In this series, I'll be developing simple models based on available data about how different factors may have affected the evolution of intelligent life on Earth, and I'll attempt to use best guesses to come to quantitative numbers as to just how common intelligent life may be in our galaxy. As an important aside, I'm going to be dismissing most forms of speculative life in this series. While gas or plasma-based life forms may be fun to think about, they're very hard to discuss in a meaningful way without immediately departing from the realm of hard science. I may, however, make asides throughout the series to explain why I think a certain form of life would or wouldn't arise in our universe. Jumping right into things, the first thing we'll do is set up a rough timeline of the universe. I apologize in advance to any physicist, as I'll be skipping huge swaths of the universe's early history in favor of the portions that are immediately impactful towards the evolution of life. Our current best estimate for the age of the universe is about 13.8 billion years. A few years after the Big Bang, nucleosynthesis occurred, creating 75% hydrogen by mass, 25% helium by mass, if we discount dark matter. At this point, the other elements were negligible. Those that weren't would quickly decay into helium or hydrogen. Over the next several hundred million years, dark matter pulled the mass into giant filaments, which eventually collapsed into stars and galaxies. The first stars were, as you would expect, mainly hydrogen and helium. They had undetectable amounts of elements that were heavier. Because of this, all the planets around the first stars would have been gas planets. Stellar astrophysicists think that these first stars would have been massive and died out after only a few million years. Many of them would have exploded as supernova, spreading heavier elements across the early universe. This was very good for budding life in our universe. More atoms, meaning different types of atoms, means more complexity, and in particular, the elements of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen allows for a massive amount of biodiversity. While some heavier than helium elements were created in the first supernova, the process of star formation and supernova would continue to increase the metallicity in our universe for the next 13.5 billion years, along with other stellar phenomena such as Wolf-Rayet stars. Around 4.6 billion years ago, our solar system was simply a large disk of dust, rocks, and ice. Then, over a few hundred million years, the dust and asteroids clumped together into planets, with most of the mass ending up in the center of the solar system, in our sun. The Earth, initially hot from its formation, cooled enough to form liquid water over the next 200 million years. At this point, Earth was at the outer limit of what we'd today call the habitable zone, the range of distances from a star where liquid water can exist. In reality, this habitable zone depends on many factors, including atmospheric condition, and will change with the solar intensity of the star. Life formed shortly after the liquid oceans formed. Early life would probably have consisted of free-floating protein strands, picking up compatible molecules from the surrounding ocean and using them to reproduce. So much of the crust has been subducted back into the mantle since the Earth's formation that very little evidence that old exists, in any sense. But life may have formed as early as 4.3 billion years ago. But life may have formed as early as 4.3 billion years ago, or as late as 3.5 billion years ago. Given the difficulty of finding that evidence, I would tend towards the earlier estimate when I start getting into my models. We do know that by 3.5 billion years ago, prokaryotes with a defined cell membrane existed. Given how quickly life arose on Earth after the formation of the oceans, it's probably reasonable to assume that there are many planets with microbial life in our galaxy. The late heavy bombardment was happening while this was going on, from 4.1 to 3.8 billion years ago. During this time, Earth was getting hit by asteroids regularly, melting portions of the crust and providing huge energy hotspots on the early Earth. The fact that life was probably present for at least the later portion of this is rather astounding, and raises the question of whether the late heavy bombardment hurt or actually helped the fledgling life forms on Earth. These early life forms were only able to use energy existing in the early oceans in the form of organic molecules. It wasn't until the advent of photosynthesis that they were able to use energy from the sun. Recent studies suggest that photosynthesis may have evolved as early as 3.4 billion years ago, and oxygen-producing synthesis, photosynthesizing creatures about 2.7 billion years ago. Fast forward to 2.45 billion years ago, and these proto-plant buggers had created so much oxygen that it caused a crisis, known as the oxygen catastrophe. You see, the early Earth had practically no molecular oxygen anywhere to be found. All of the atomic oxygen was in H2O molecules and CO2 molecules. To early life, oxygen was as toxic as carbon monoxide is to us. Starting 2.45 billion years ago, it took 600 million years for oxygen to rise to 3% of the atmosphere, killing most life in the process. Over the next billion years, oxygen levels stayed constant as the rocks on Earth's surface absorbed oxygen at the same rate it was produced. By 500 million years ago, oxygen had roughly reached its current level. While all this was happening, around 2.1 billion years ago, eukaryotes evolved. What distinguishes a eukaryote from a prokaryote is the existence of internal organelles, such as a nucleus, ribosomes, and mitochondria. Eukaryotes are much larger to accommodate these organelles, and also much more flexible in function as a result. They can exist alone as yeasts, algae, or amoeba. They can also exist as part of a multicellular organism. Animals, fungi, algae, and land plants are all eukaryotes, and evolved multicellularity independently. Researchers believe that the last eukaryotic common ancestor had already evolved sexuality to enable DNA mixing between organisms. While mostly single-celled organisms continued to evolve and shift in the oceans, the land remained dead. At this point, soil did not exist. All the land was either rocks or sand created by weathering. Possibly as early as 1.2 billion years ago, early photosynthesizers unrelated to plants may have begun to colonize the land. These organisms would have formed little more than a dry algal or lichen-like layer on the early Earth. While the exact first appearance of animals is debated, there is accepted evidence of the emergence of both cnidarians and bilaterians. Sorry if I butchered the pronunciation, biologists. Around 580 million years ago, the ancestors of all creatures with a nervous system. This was only about 40 million years before the Cambrian explosion. The general trend for the evolution of the brain has been one of increasing complexity. Based on the fact that, for instance, we're more closely related to sea stars than we are to octopi, we know that much of this complexity evolved in separate evolutionary lines. Over the next 550 million years, brains evolved in a variety of fashions. In insects, we see one branch in which brains allowed incredible, complex, eusocial behavior for the good of a hive. In octopi, we see a branch in which brains allowed for amazing spatial learning and navigational abilities, and honed hunting ability. In primates, we see a branch in which brains allowed for precise hand-eye coordination, trajectory calculation, and high adaptability to different environments. How and why the brain evolved the way it did seems to be largely an open question, so I'll make some educated speculation. We know that large brains are very metabolically costly, and that if intelligence were a survival-neutral trait, most animals would have small brains. In addition, many species of animals have shown themselves to be quite intelligent in a variety of ways. Ravens have been shown to solve complex puzzles. Octopi have been shown to use extremely creative methods to escape from their tanks and cages. Apes have learned sign language, and bees use a sort of language to communicate the exact location of nectar to each other. I would propose 3 points. First, I'd propose that the brain has historically been an instrument of sensory perception and interpretation, more so than a generalized thinking machine as we often think of it today. Indeed, we see the first mammals' brains were likely very good at smelling and little else. Even today, most of the human brain is for vision, hearing, smell, touch, and interpretation thereof. Second, I'd propose that intelligence is a sort of arms race between different species. A predator is most successful who has as or more intelligence than his prey, and vice versa. However, a predator who needs to expend huge amounts of energy to upkeep a gigantic brain is not necessarily the most successful predator. Finally, I would propose that about 3 million years ago, humans reached a tipping point, at which intelligence became the defining feature of our species. I can think of no other way to explain the way that we went from simple apes to the world-dominating force we are in only 3 million years, tripling our brain size in the process. Once we reached that critical point, there was no way of stopping us, short of destroying half the planet. Perhaps that critical point was increased social cohesion. Perhaps it was tool-making, perhaps it was language, and perhaps it was something else. We simply don't know. That's a basic summary of the most relevant events in the universe to this series. Starting in episode 2, we'll start looking at a generalized probability model for the evolution of life developed by yours truly. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like, comment, or subscribe for the rest of the series. Goodbye for now.